Hello and good afternoon to the UC Berkeley Alumni Virtual Book Club. Thank you so much for joining us today for this author talk to hear from Berkeley alumnus Daniel James Brown, class of 1974, the author of our first reading selection, The Boys in the Boat. I'm Rachel Barley with the Office of Alumni Relations at UC Berkeley, and I couldn't be happier that Dan very generously agreed to dedicate some time in his busy schedule to speak with us about his book. When my office first started thinking about launching a virtual book club that would be available to all alumni from every class year, regardless of major or degree or geographic region, we knew we wanted to have at least some of the book selections focus on stories and or authors with a connection to the university. With The Boys in the Boat, we not only get an author who's a Berkeley alum, but we get the University of California crew team in the critical supporting role of main rival. I thought it was a fascinating and really engaging read, and I hope you did as well. Our guest of honor today, Daniel James Brown, grew up here in the East Bay and attended Diablo Valley College before transferring to Cal and earning a Bachelor of Arts in English. He then earned a master's degree in literature from UCLA. His narrative nonfiction books have garnered critical acclaim and spent weeks atop the charts. The Boys in the Boat remained on the New York Times bestseller list for 150 weeks and has sold over 3 million copies stateside since its publication in 2013. Dan and his wife currently live in the Pacific Northwest, where he's an avid outdoorsman. Leading the discussion with Dan today is another Berkeley alumnus, Pete Cipollone, class of 94. Pete made his way out to Berkeley from Pennsylvania to attend Cal, where he was a coxswain of the crew team all 4 years. After graduating with a degree in economics, Pete was a coxswain for the U.S. rowing team from 1994 to 2004, winning gold medals in the 95, 97, 98, and 99 World Rowing Championships, as well as a gold medal at the 2004 Summer Olympics in Athens, where his team set the world record. We're glad to have both of these gentlemen with us today. We solicited some questions for Dan in advance via the online book forum, and we encourage you to ask additional questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will get to as many of those as we can. And with that, I will turn it over to our guests to start the discussion. Pete and Dan.
All right. Dan, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure.
Nice to see you again, Pete. It's been a while. It's a lot of fun for me to be doing a Cal thing. I've done so many UW things over the last few years that I relish the opportunity to come back home to Cal.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, cool. Let's dive right in. And maybe we can start off just by talking a bit about your career path at Berkeley between spring of '74, when you graduated with a BA in English, and today. And maybe just at a high level, what was the road that led you to writing best-selling narrative nonfiction?
Yeah, it's been a sort of indirect, roundabout, winding path. So let's see, after I graduated from Cal, well, I had my illustrious 3-day career in law school. I dropped out of law school after 3 days, decided it wasn't for me. Then I went to UCLA and got a master's in English. I was an English major at Cal. And actually what I set my sights on, what I really wanted to do was I wanted to be a community college English instructor. I had great English instructor at my community college, Diablo Valley. And then I had great English instructors at Cal and at UCLA. So, I wanted to be a community college English teacher, and it was really hard to get jobs since then. I got a couple job offers from very remote places that my then fiance wasn't willing to move to. So I wound up teaching on an adjunct basis at various community colleges, but mostly at San Jose State and, sorry to say, at Stanford. Actually, it was great at Stanford. I had great students. So I did that for 7 or 8 years. I taught English at college level at various places. When my wife got pregnant and we wanted to try to buy a house, we couldn't. She was also a college teacher. Couldn't really do that in the Bay Area on teaching salaries. So I remember in the San Jose Mercury, I saw a little one-line ad for something called Microsoft, which I had no idea what Microsoft was really. And so I applied for a technical writing, technical editing job, and wound up coming up here to Redmond, and wound up spending 12 years working at Microsoft, which was interesting. A lot of really smart people. Wasn't really my passion, though. I always wanted to write or have something to do with writing other than editing software manuals. So I left Microsoft in 2000, and I decided I was just going to take a little time and see if I could write a book. I had no idea if I could write a book. I wrote a book. It didn't. I sold it for a very small amount of money to a very obscure publisher, but that sort of got the ball rolling. That book, Barnes and Noble has a thing called Discover Great New Writers, where they pick unknown writers and put the books out at the front of the store. I don't know if they still do, but they did then. And so that got that book some attention, and a bigger publisher bought the rights to that, and it just sort of took off from there. And so I've had this basically a third career as an author, and it's been great. It's been the most rewarding part of my career track.
Cool. And so how, like, nonfiction, how did you land on that? And like, did you ever have any interest in writing fiction?
Yeah, I suppose when I was in Berkeley, wandering the streets at night, reading Dostoevsky and Faulkner, I'm sure I dreamed of becoming, a great novelist at some point. But I always have read a lot of history. As I was getting older, I read a lot of narrative nonfiction, which is what I write, historically based nonfiction, but in a narrative form. And so that's what I was reading a lot of. And actually, there's a great book, Seabiscuit by Laura Hillenbrand, that I happened to be reading right when I started working on The Boys in the Boat. And that became kind of a model for me. And actually, I got to know Laura, and she's become a good friend. So yeah, so that's just sort of the form I fell into, writing narrative nonfiction. I'm really comfortable with it. It's unlike fiction, there's a structure of facts that you are bound by, and so the story is laid out in front of you, and your job is basically to capture it and make it as interesting and lively as possible. So yeah, it seemed like that was a good fit for me, and so that's what I've done for the last 4 books. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if I get to say so myself, I really feel like you brought, I mean, certainly the sport of rowing to life in this book. So thank you.
Sure.
All right. So now let's see. From the preface of The Boys in the Boat, it seems like you kind of stumbled across this story while pointing at something different, right? Researching a different topic. Can
Yeah,
you
actually,
tell us a little bit about that?
sure. Yeah, actually, I was finishing up a previous book, and so my head was in that. And it's actually a homeowners association meeting. Horrible, dreadful thing, actually. It was at my home that year. So the homeowners all came to my house, and we had this meeting. Afterwards, this lady came up to me, and she introduced herself as Judy, my neighbor. Didn't really know, but she had been reading my first book to her father, who was living under hospice care at her home. And he was enjoying that book, and she asked if I'd come down to meet him. So I think it was the next day. I went down and I met this elderly gentleman named Joe Rance. And Joe, it turned out he was in the last couple months of his life, but he was very clear-headed and very engaged when I sat down and talked to him. And he talked for quite a while about his childhood growing up during the Depression, and he had this, for people who've read the book, they know the hardships he went through during the Depression. But then what really got my ear was when he started talking about how he'd come to the University of Washington in 1933 and joined the crew mostly in order to get a job, because as long as you were on the crew, you could the university would give you a part-time job. So he talked about that and how the rowing had sort of begun to turn his life around and redeem his life in certain ways, and created these bonds of friendship and fellowship with the other fellows he rowed with. And then he told me how he had wound up rowing. He and his guys had wound up rowing in Berlin in 1936 against a German boat and an Italian boat, amongst others, in front of Hitler and all the other top Nazis, and won the gold medal. And it was just this great story. I mean, it just, as a writer, you just, you look and you look and you look for a story like that, and you can't find it. And then it walks to your house during a homeowners meeting. So yeah, that's how that got started.
Okay, so I have two follow-ups to that. One is how often does okay, something like that, right? Just kind of like you stumble into it. But then does it ever happen that like you're focused on one theme or story or something like that, and it ends up leading you in a totally different direction when you're doing your research?
Yeah, I mean, to tell you the truth, what usually happens, it happens all too often, is you get a great story. Somebody sends you a packet of stuff about their great grandmother or whatever, and it sounds like a great story, and they're excited, and you're excited. 9 times out of 10, it just sort of fizzles out because, yeah, it's a great story if you happen to be a member of that family, but it doesn't really have any, wider appeal. So whenever I go looking for book topics, there's a lot of dead ends, trails that lead to dead ends. And it's really hard to find one that as you dig into it, it just opens up more and more stories. And the Boys in the Boat story really did. I mean, I was blown away. That first day I met Joe Rance, um, I knew that Joe had had this experience. I knew he was a really nice guy, but it could have been Joe and 8 jerks in a boat for all I knew. I didn't know, the other guys at all. So I had to get to know their families and all that. But it was a story that as I dug in, I learned about rowing. I learned about this guy named George Pocock, the boat builder, and I learned, I learned so much about the history, and just more and more interesting things opened up ahead of me. So it was an extremely arduous few years when I was researching it, but it was probably the most rewarding time I've ever had as a writer, because it was just such a rich vein of material.
Oh, that's so cool. It is. I was probably like the last generation where the rite of passage was you. The first boat you rode in was a Pocock with Pocock oars and all of that. So yeah, amazing. Now, this is a personal follow-up question. So I swore up and down that I was going to reread the book before we got here today, but I have a 3-year-old, so that sort of put paid to that plan. I made it through the preface again, though. And in the preface, you talk about, so when you're first meeting with Joe, right? And he says, but it's got to be about the boat, right? It's got to be about the boat. And I read that and I knew, oh, okay, I know exactly what it means. But you said it took you a little while to sort out exactly what he meant. So my question is, as you figured that out, kind of what did you learn that surprised you? And then what was it about the boat, right, crew, that you found, like most, I guess, surprising or delightful?
Yeah. So, I mean, I literally, when he said, I asked him, I just point blank, I sort of blurted out, Joe, can I write a book about your life? And he immediately said no, shook his head and looked down. And I was like, oh, God. But then he said, but you could write a book about the boat. And yeah, I didn't know what he meant at first. I thought he meant the Husky Clipper, this, beautiful Pocock shell that they had rowed in. And it took me a few beats at least to realize that what was important to him was that I write the story in such a way that it was about all of them together, what they all did together, sort of what they all became together back in the 1930s. And that was a revelation to me. I mean, I personally don't think there's any sport where um, teamsmanship, cooperation, camaraderie, brotherhood, sisterhood are so important as they are in crew. It's just, and that was what surprised me as I learned more about rowing and talking to the family members of the other guys who rowed with him, and then also going out and just talking, because I didn't know anything about the sport. So I spent a lot of time down at the Husky Shell House and wherever I could find rowers talking about what's the experience of being on a crew like. And it just became very clear to me that it was about a lot of things, but the sort of central thing that just kept coming up over and over again was the bonds that you form with the other people in the boat. And I guess it can sound a little cliched, but it became this sort of resounding truth that was right at the heart of what I learned about crew. So yeah.
Cool. Okay. Well, we have a follow-up question from a club member in a little bit on that. But what I'd like to do now is we're going to go to some of the club member questions. And so this one is from Margaret Foley. She says, I have a question about Joe Rance. It sounds as though he was quite fragile and elderly when you met him. Were his memories pretty accurate? Did it take a lot of corroboration and supplementation to tell the story of the book?
So yes, 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 and yes. So yes, first of all, his memory was very sharp, particularly for a man who was quite weak. He was on oxygen, and I mean, I was only able to spend a lot of time with him the first month or so, and then he got too sick. But what helped enormously was that his daughter Judy had spent the last several years of her dad's life documenting it, just asking him, filling up notebooks, asking him questions about very specific things like the day your family abandoned you out in Squim. What was there to eat? What was in the refrigerator? And so, and she recorded all this. So Judy, with all the stuff she had collected, was the single biggest, source of information for that I had to work with. And then I needed to go find the family members of the other guys because by then they had all passed away. So it was a lot. There was a lot of work about, going to and meeting people and hearing their stories and looking at their diaries or whatever they might have. So there wound up being an enormous amount of material, an enormous amount of corroboration, most of which all held together pretty well. I mean, when you're writing about things that happened 75, 80 years before, there's always going to be, some memories are different than other memories. So there was a lot of work involved in figuring out the right answer to a particular question. Fortunately, the Crew was written about in sports papers a lot in the 1930s. And so I spent countless hours at the University of Washington Library, a little bit actually down at Cal too, on microfilm reading newspapers from the 1930s. And almost every week, at least during Crew season, there were these long, beautifully written, detailed stories about not just races, but weeks before a race, what the coxswain was thinking and saying, and what the coaches were saying, and what Ebright was saying to Ulbrichtson to try to fake him out. And there was just all this really colorful story, particularly about the Cal UW rivalry. So that was really helpful in terms of corroboration and getting detail for the actual rowing stuff.
Okay, so now let's turn to like the nuts and bolts of that, right? As you're doing the research, you're corroborating, you're talking to, lots and lots of people who are, by this point, maybe, one degree of separation away from the principles and, spending a lot of time on, microfiche. How do you develop dialogue for historical books?
Yeah, so I never put anything in quotation marks, that is, as a direct quote, unless I have a source for it, unless it has been said somewhere in the record. So that might, but of course, these people weren't carrying tape recorders around in the 1930s. So if you look at the book, there's actually relatively little that's in direct quotes for that very reason. But when there are direct quotes, when I quote people, it's because somebody, like for instance, Joe told Judy that my dad said such and such. And so then that can become a direct quote in the book. But I'm not very rigorous about only using quotation marks when there's a record of that comment having been made. Did I get the exact wording? Who knows? But yeah, I'm pretty rigorous about that, actually.
Yeah. Okay, now another club member, Fred Farr. Fred Farr says, thank you for an engaging, well-crafted book. I was a rower at Berkeley in 77 and 78, and I was especially impressed by your insights into what it takes to row well. Where and from whom did you learn the intricacies of rowing?
Yeah, so, when I started, the day after I met Joe, I thought to myself, God, I don't know the first thing about rowing. My dad went to Cal, as I did, and at the same time that Joe and these guys were at UW. And I remember my dad, when I was a boy, I remember my dad talking about Kai Bright and Cal Crew and what a great tradition it was and what a great program it was. But that all just blew right by me as a kid. I wasn't really paying attention. So I knew when I started this project, I knew that I knew nothing about rowing. So one of the first things I did is I went down to the University of Washington shell house, Conibear shell house, and Luke McGee, who was then the freshman coach there,
Yeah.
put me in a launch and took me out. I think it was like a February day, and it was, just bitter cold and raining as it always is. And we went out, and so he was working with the freshmen, and they were sprinting up and down the Montlake Cut, and these guys were red in the face and bare chested and just really working hard. And I was just, whoa. And then we came back to the shell house. These guys paddled out of their boats and they went in and they sat down at ergs and started pulling erg machines, rowing machines, for another hour or so. And so those kinds of things, and then I spent a lot of time talking to his guys, and then through them I met other rowers at different programs. And so I just spent a lot of time observing rowing, and then more importantly, talking to rowers about the physical demands, the mental demands, the highs, the lows, what it's like to row in flat water, what it's like to row in rough water, what it's like to row with a current, against a current, everything I could think of to try to just sort of get the feel of it. And I think that was probably, the biggest single challenge from me was, writing about a sport that I had never done myself and didn't know much about it all to start. So a lot of learning went into that. But it was, it was really interesting. And now I've become a fan of the sport big time.
Oh, cool. Yeah, you made a ton of new fans for the sport as well. I can certainly tell you that. So yeah, it's pretty cool. All right, so this one is from Paul Gill. I was intrigued by your emphasis on the class differences between Washington Crew and possibly other West Coast schools, and the Ivy League dominance of the sport. I found the contrast you described between Washington Crews and, say, the Princetons and Harvards fascinating. What do you think accounts for the development of interest in rowing among, let's say, non-prep school types?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it was so conspicuous when I started reading all those press accounts, because I was reading New East Coast papers and I was reading West Coast papers, the Seattle Times and the PI and the Chronicle. And so it didn't take long to see that there was this very distinct regional rivalry that was also a kind of class rivalry, because at that time, not all, but a lot of the rowing programs in the East were at the Ivy Leagues, and a lot of those kids had learned to row in prep schools or whatever. And the guys out here on the West Coast at Cal and at Washington, I think especially at Washington, were, they'd grown up at logging camps, and their parents were fishermen in Gulf of Alaska, and worked in boat yards in Seattle. And these were very, very working class kids. And I think part of it was just they wanted to sort of earn some respect for West Coast rowing. They wanted to earn some respect for working class people. I mean, Cal had really gone ahead. Cal had sort of become a dominant factor in rowing by this time. So it wasn't just Washington, it was really Cal and Washington in particular that sort of changed that narrative. And whoa, all of a sudden, these kids out of the logging camps in the Northwest are actually pretty darn good. It's just sort of flipped the script on what a lot of people back east thought about rowing. And you can see that in a lot of the newspaper writing of the time. There's a kind of bewilderment almost about how this happened to their
Where did they come from?
Yeah, where did these guys come from?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, as you say, right back then, rowing made the sports page in the New York Times, right, and it would be a big deal, when you had national championships. So, I wonder if it was that kind of thing, like, hey, look at what we can do.
Yeah, I mean, I think also just generally, particularly here in Seattle, this is less true in the Bay Area, but Seattle sort of felt like it wasn't even on the map in the 1930s. It wasn't, particularly in the East Coast, people literally didn't know where Seattle was in many cases. And so there was also kind of a regional thing going on in the Puget Sound area here, like, hey, we're here. We're not actually camping out in the woods for all the time, and we're civilized. So there was a sort of a regional thing that was going on in that sense too.
All right, so from one of your classmates, Dwight Baker. I thoroughly enjoyed reading The Boys in the Boat. Wondering about Joe's true feelings concerning his teammates. Did Joe feel rejected early on? And the story of them teasing him about his interest in playing music appears somewhat insensitive. Do you think there was some bullying going on within the team?
Yeah, I know there was. So, not everybody that came out for crew were as poor as Joe and a lot of the guys that wound up in that boat. A lot of them, even though it was the Depression, came from pretty prosperous or stable families. And so those kids, most of whom washed out out of the program fairly early, those kids, they had nice slacks and shiny shoes and nice crisp sweaters, and they teased particularly Joe because Joe was probably the poorest of the bunch of them. He literally wore the same sweater, gosh, I don't know, for the whole 4 years he was there, I think. He wore this moldy old sweater, and that shoes had holes in them, and so he got ribbed a lot. And then his taste in music, he loved to play country music. He played the banjo and had kind of that kind of musical taste. And so he would do that, and they'd mock him, call him a hobo. And but that was like in 1933, 34, as the crews were coming together. And first of all, Joe earned their respect by being a really good oarsman. But also the complexion of the crew changed over time. Most of the kids that wound up in that 36 boat were also from pretty humble backgrounds. And so that fell by the wayside along the way. And by the end, certainly, they were extraordinarily bonded together. But yes, early on, he was I think bullied is probably not too strong a word for it, something like that anyway.
Yeah, a little bit of my own experience here. It's funny, like how very quickly, you can develop respect for somebody who's so good at something that you want to be that good at, right? So, fortunately, it sounds like some of that stuff kind of melted away.
Yeah, it did. And the guys that wound up in that boat in 1936, they very much had earned their way there. And Coach Ulbrichtson was, particularly in that year of 1936, he was mixing and matching and putting different combinations in different boats. And it was really, I mean, I remember I found Ulbrichtson's logbook at the Special Collections in University of Washington Library, and I was looking at the time trials that spring. And literally the day he put Joe Rance into the number 7 seat, I don't remember the numbers, but the time just increased dramatically. And the next day it was even better. And the day after that, it was even better. So it really made a huge difference putting Joe in that boat. That was sort of the catalyst. The other guys were great, oarsmen, particularly Don Hume, I think. But it was just the right combination, and it sort of unlocked that boat, I think.
Awesome. You're foreshadowing some of our next questions. So do you think Ulbrichtson's style of keeping the athletes unsure of their position on the team ultimately inspired them or hindered them?
Yeah, so I'm going to be pretty candid here about Al Ulbrichtson. I've met a lot over the years, last 10 years. I've met a lot of now older men who rode for Ulbrichtson along the way, and they don't all have warm, fuzzy feelings about him. He was a really tough guy, and he was really pretty relentless, and didn't worry much about the feelings of any particular boy at any particular time, I would say. So that was tempered a lot on that in that crew house, that shell house, by the presence of George Pocock, who had a very different approach. He was much
Mhm.
more inclined to sort of work with a boy and work out figure out what is going on in his head and what kind of problems he might be having. And so he was a much more patient kind of mentor than Ulbrichtson was. So Ulbrichtson was hard. I do think he was a remarkably effective coach. And to me, the really positive thing about Ulbrichtson, it was what I was referring to. He was kind of a magician or an alchemist in terms of finding the right mix of, types. And I mean, I'm sure you know this as a coxswain. A boat often has a lot of different kinds of personality types in the same boat, and different physical capabilities too. And so to me, part of the interest of the sport is sort of mixing and matching that coaches have to do to find that right combination that just clicks and everything starts working. And it's partly just, how well the guys get along, how much they trust each other, and so on and so forth. But Ulbrichtson was good at finding the right combination, I think.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, like that's where the magic happens.
Yeah.
Look, let me follow on to that. Uh, did you do any sort of similar background research on Kai Ebright?
Yeah, so actually came down to Cal and went to the Bancroft Library and found some of Ebright's correspondence with George Pocock, because Cal was buying boats from Pocock at the same time that other schools were, of course.
Yeah.
And there actually was this dispute broke out between Ebright and Pocock. Ebright thought Pocock was sending him second-rate boats, and Pocock got very offended by that. And so there was some very colorful correspondence that flew back and forth between the two of them there for a few months. But yeah, I mean, I because the focus of the story was on the Washington crew, of course, I spent a lot more time trying to get inside Ulbrichtson's head than Kai Ebright's head. But Ebright was a great coach. He had come from the University of Washington as a coxswain. And so that part of the history was important. And he had a quite different style from Ulbrichtson too. He was very verbal, and Ulbrichtson was very reticent. So I did spend quite a bit of time trying to understand Ebright, but I spent more time trying to get inside Ulbrichtson's head.
All right. So the next question, it says either for you or for me, do Olympic rowing teams still come from one university as an established team, rather than gathering outstanding individuals from separate teams like in other Olympic sports such as baseball, basketball, hockey, etc.?
Yeah,
So you want to take that one?
no, you should take it because you've done it. And I don't know exactly when the transition was.
Sure. So the transition was 1972 was the first Olympics where it was not the eight that was the winner of the Olympic trials. And so from 1968 to the beginning, so back to 1896, they would have trials. And most often a university crew would win. Cool stat. Cal won it more than anybody else and won 3 Olympic gold medals. And that is a feat that will never be repeated. So no university team will ever win 3 Olympic gold medals in the 8 ever again. But so up until then, it was just everybody comes together, they race, and may the fastest crew win. And then in 1960, the United States lost the 8 for the second time in history, and it caused all kinds of chaos. So by 1972, they said we're going to treat this like a combine. And it started out like the NBA. They'd kind of bring all the best people together for a couple weeks, pick a crew, and go. Now it is a multi-year long process. So you move to a place where the training center is, and there might be 30 athletes training over the course of 4 years, 8 years, whatever it is. And the crew gets picked that way. So hopefully that answers the question.
So I have a question back for you though. Which do you think
Yeah.
is the superior way of putting a boat together?
So at this point in time, it's pretty undisputed that the combine, bringing everyone together for a camp, is really the only way you can be competitive.
Okay.
There are, first of all, most collegiate teams now are comprised of, they're multinational, right? So Cal, for example, who is perennial contender, might have 4 athletes who are not from the U.S. So you can't just take that crew and send them to the U.S. Olympic trials. So that's one thing. But just to be competitive, you have to, you really have to go get the best people. But it's also rowers peak around age 30. So it's, taking a bunch of 22 or 23-year-olds, it would be really, really tough to compete.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned Don Hume earlier. Do you think they could have won without Don, or without anyone, or how important was that combination?
Yeah, so I think if there's one guy that they definitely couldn't have won without, would be Don Hume. I mean, I think also Joe Rance, because as I say, that's when the boat really took off. Oh God, it's hard to know what would happen if you took Roger Morris or any of the one other individuals out and put another one in. It's really, really hard to say. But I would particularly point to Don Hume. He was a really great stroke oar, and the other guys just had enormous respect for him. So the fact that he was so sick going into the gold medal round of those races, that was a huge concern. I mean, if you've read the book, that at the end, Don Hume was so sick with some kind of respiratory illness the day of the final gold medal race, that Ulbrichtsen was not going to put him in the boat. He was going to put the substitute in the boat. And it was so uncharacteristic, but the rest of the guys went to Ulbrichtsen that morning, I think it was, and they said, no, he's come all this way with us. He's got to be in the boat. We'll pull him across the line if we have to, but he's got to be in the boat. And they didn't talk back to Ulbrichtsen usually. It was really uncharacteristic for them to go to Ulbrichtsen and say, this is the way it's got to be. Don Hume's got to be in the boat. And it's one of those moments that I think almost sends chills down my spine, because as I say, you have to understand Ulbrichtsen to know how the guts it took to do that. But Ulbrichtsen thought about it, and he thought about it, and he said, Don, go get your stuff, get in the boat, and off they went.
And that's my own. I mean, I never had an experience that extreme, but I think you get to the point as a team where you feel like, hey, like, we're going to sink or swim together, right?
Yeah.
Like we have bonded, and either we make it or we don't, but we're doing this together. So
yeah, I mean, I think those guys were literally willing to, not win that gold medal race if they had to, if that's what it took, but they were going to have them in the boat.
So now let's go to the moment. In your research, did you find any justification for the weird and seemingly unfair lane assignment that the U.S. team was given in the final?
Yeah, so they were mysteriously put out in lanes 5 and 6 out in the windiest part of the course. Germany and Italy were put in lanes 1 and 2, sheltered virtually the whole length of the course from the winds. I didn't find a smoking gun. I looked hard for a smoking gun that would prove that the Germans involved in the Olympic Committee had rigged it that way. Didn't find a smoking gun, but I also didn't find a good explanation. So that remains for me kind of a mystery, exactly what happened there. I believe the German or the IOC line was that it was simply a random lottery, and but it's pretty hard to believe, because the difference was very significant. And it was also the British boat. The British and American boats were in 5 and 6, and the Italian and the German boats, the two fascist powers, were in the protected lanes. So it's very, very fishy. And that's where I left it in the book, because I couldn't really prove it one way or the other.
Yeah, we always called that a home job, and I will say that there is a particular rowing powerhouse in the Seattle area that's known for that. Okay, so this from Karen Holmes. Thank you for creating such an engaging book. Since you're a Berkeley alumnus yourself, I wonder if you had any conflicting feelings about the competition between Kai Bright and the Cal crew, and that of Al Ulbrichtson and the University of Washington. Did you find yourself rooting for Cal occasionally, or were you totally invested in Washington's successes?
Yeah, so my head got all screwed up during this whole process, let me tell you. Um, yeah, so well, first of all, I spent a lot of time down at the Husky Shell House, researching I didn't tell anybody I went to Cal. I was deliberate.
Yeah,
Uh,
probably smart.
I think they'd be as cooperative if they knew that. I did, because on the one hand, I was writing about these characters. I got to know these guys. I was in their heads. I was definitely seeing these races from their point of view. But I mean, I'm Cal. My parents went to Cal. I was born in Berkeley, raised in Berkeley. I went to Cal. When the two schools play in anything, I'm rooting for Cal. So it was kind of a weird head thing for me. I had similar experience. I found myself kind of feeling a little guilty sometimes because, basically Cal is the rival. Kai is the bad guy in a sense. He's not the bad guy, but he's the rival. And so yeah, it was challenging that way. But I really thought my job was, maybe someday I'll write a book about Cal Crew. But my job here is to talk about these guys and what they did, and you know, make sure that I cover Cal in a reasonable and accurate, fair way. I certainly didn't want to demonize Cal or anything like that, but I didn't need to. It was all just worked itself out. So yeah, it was complex for me.
And I mean, in that era, Cal, like Kai's crews and Cal, they were to some degree the evil empire, right? I mean, they were kind of like Sparta, right? That like nobody wanted to go up against them.
Yeah, I mean they were very good, and also the rivalry between Washington and Cal was very very strong. It ebbed and flowed, but it was quite. I think if it was Ebright or Ulbrichtson said it was vicious and bloody, or used some language like I think it was Ebright that said that. It was it was a serious rivalry. So I wanted to capture that rivalry and then just leave it for people that went to whichever school, just feel however you're going to feel about it. But yeah, so.
Cool. Okay, so just a couple more questions, and let's start with the movie is coming up. What are you most excited about?
Well, first of all, I'm just excited it's finally being made because it's been 10 years since we sold the movie rights to the book, and it's gone through all kinds of weird convolutions in Hollywood. Hollywood's a complete jungle. So I'm just relieved it's finally been made. I like it. George Clooney invited me and my wife down to a screening of it back in August. So it's quite a while ago now that I've seen it. It definitely compresses a lot of events into basically just covers the 1936 year. Um, and so there's a lot of storylines that are in the book that aren't in the movie, but really it's pretty much necessary. It would have been a 4 or 5 hour movie if you had told all the different storylines adequately. So I think Clooney and company did a pretty good job of sort of compressing the drama into that year-long period. And it really, yeah, I mean, it captures the spirit of the story, and that's the thing I cared most about. And I think people are going to come out of the theaters, smiling, feeling good. He said, and I agree with him, that it was time. We've got, we have so much divisiveness in the country now, and so many movies are just dark and cynical. He wanted to make a feel-good, uplifting, heartwarming kind of movie, and he saw this story as a way to do that. And I'm good with that. I think that's the right thing to do. So yeah, I think when people see it, they're gonna come out of the theater feeling warm and fuzzy and good.
Okay, good. That was going to be my next question, which is, did he succeed? But it sounds promising. So okay, we have a live question. In your experience, what is one characteristic or trait that every rower ought to have?
Wow. Yeah. Over the years, I've met so many now. I can see a rower coming, and not just by their height, but by the way they present themselves. Oh, one characteristic. I mean, there's so many. resilience, persistence, mental toughness. That I think more than that, I think it's kind of, you got to have a certain level of sort of social adeptness. You got to be able to work with other people on some pretty fundamental level, even if you're competing with those people for a seat in the boat. There's competition and there's cooperation, and you got to find the balance between those two things. And in my experience, first of all, I have found in 10 years of running around the country talking to rowers, I've talked to many people who rowed some in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. They tend to be really successful people. A lot of doctors, lawyers, people with very impressive resumes did crew in their universities. So I think that element of learning to work with people is sort of the thing I'd point to as the most important sort of single attribute that I think I see in rowers.
Yeah, you definitely have to be able to put the goal in front of your ego.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's it. That's a good way of putting it. Putting the goal in front of your ego. I mean, these guys all had healthy egos, and those showed themselves sometimes. But yeah, fundamentally, the sport is about pulling together, and that only happens if you are all in it together, and if the goal is the most important thing rather than your particular glory or your particular concerns.
Okay, now we're going to take it back to the process of writing. What is your writing process? Do you do all your research up front, or do you kind of like mix and match and do it as you go? How does that play out?
I feel like swiveling around and showing you my desktop. My writing process is an unholy mess. Nobody should ever emulate it. I'll describe it to you, but it's don't take it as advice. I just gather. So when I'm writing on a big nonfiction book like this, I spend a couple years at least just gathering information. And that's why my desk gets heaped up with books and folders and files and letters and photographs. And I'm terrible at organizing them, but I'm just sort of taking stuff in for a couple years. While I'm doing that, I only write one thing. I create a Word document. I create a timeline, just a date, and this happened on that date, this happened that day. And 90% of those dates don't actually get used, but it just gives me a quick way. And by the end of the process, that document might be 20 pages long. It gives me a way of looking through and saying, oh yeah, that's the big storm that came in just before the race they had in April or something like that. It just gives me a sort of landmarks, conceptual landmark. This is all the stuff that happened between point A and point B. Now, what things do you want to talk about between point A and point B? So then I sit down and I basically write from the beginning to the end. Some people start with the end, and I start with the beginning. I write in chunks that I call scenes, and they might be anywhere from a paragraph to 4 or 5 pages, but I write them in discrete. I use the word scenes deliberately because I'm always trying to make the writing as visual as possible, as if I'm looking at what's happening through a camera lens. And so keeping that in my head as I write scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, scene 4. As I'm writing them, I put those scenes in a drawer or whatever, and then I don't look at them for a while I go on and write more stuff. But then, and this is very important, I circle back at some point to scene 1 and I read it again. And always I'll say, I see stuff in it that sounded good when I wrote it and sounds horrible now. And so I do a lot of iterative going back and looping and fixing things, making them better, progressing, going back, fixing something earlier. So it becomes this sort of iterative back and forth as I'm working my way through the story. And then eventually I get to a whole manuscript, and I've, written all the scenes, I've looked at all the scenes, I've gotten them coherent as I think I can. But then I send it off to my editor and she starts me all over. She has her own ideas about what works and doesn't work. Well, I actually have had great relationships with my editors, particularly Wendy Wolf, the editor who did my last couple of books. We've had almost no run-ins. She's been doing this a long time and I respect her opinion a lot. So if she says, for instance, I got obsessed when I was writing about the German part of it. I got obsessed with the way the Nazis used the Berlin Olympics as a propaganda tool. And I got obsessed with Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, and how cynical he was. And I wrote probably 20 or 25 pages more about Goebbels than needed to be in the book. And so, because I was obsessed by him and it seemed really important to me to tell this part of the story. But, Wendy came along and said, a little Nazi goes a long way, okay? We get it. And so she cut some pretty significant chunks there, but it was the right thing to do.
Okay. We're down to our last question.
Okay.
So let's take it all the way back home. What are some of your favorite memories or experiences at Cal?
Oh, God. So I love Cal. I mean, as I say, I was born in Berkeley, lived first 10 years of my life in Berkeley. It's always been home. My dad went to Cal back in the days of Ebright. My mom actually went back to Cal when I did in the early 70s. She went back to school when she was in her 50s. So for a year there, she and I were going to school together at the same time. It was just, I love everything about Cal. I was an English major, and so I think the thing that I enjoyed most was the academics, actually. I had a couple of English teachers that just completely lit me up. One in particular, Carolyn Porter, who I think later became the Dean of Letters and Science. But that was long after I was gone. When I was there, she was a relatively young, new faculty member. And I was really interested in the works of William Faulkner. So I took a class from her. And then she created this honors seminar where 7 or 8 of us that had been in that class the next quarter would go to her apartment one night a week. And we'd drink wine and we listen to records and we talk about Faulkner. And it was just the most glorious thing. It was the kind of thing an undergraduate very seldom gets to experience. We just in her home, studying Faulkner, getting excited about Faulkner, drinking red wine, talking some more about Faulkner. It was just a wonderful experience. She was a wonderful, wonderful teacher and, a real highlight for me.
Daniel, thank you so much, man. It's always, it's amazing to listen to you talk. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you both. Yeah, so much. This was a fantastic conversation. And thank you again, Dan, for agreeing to speak to this group. We're really honored to have gotten this time with you. And I wish you good luck as you dive into what will undoubtedly be a busy season of interviews and press, probably in advance of the Christmas Day release of the film. So Godspeed to you. And also, no joke, I have an HOA meeting at 4 o'clock today, and I can only hope that there will be some life-changing, interesting nugget that comes out of that. It seems unlikely, but now we know. Now we know it's a possibility.
Absolutely. You never know.
You never know. And for our book club members, I hope you're all gearing up to read the next selection, The Mountains Sing, which was determined by a vote in the online forum. That reading period begins on January 5th, and you'll see communications about it in the forum. We'll also post a link to this Zoom recording in the online forum before the end of this week. So with that, I wish everyone a good December, a safe, joyous, peaceful holiday season, and a great start to 2024. And Fiat Lux and Go Bears. Thank you all.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.